In this slideshow, we're going to talk about the ethics of social research, or why it's important to follow ethical rules or guidelines when we're conducting social research with human subjects or human participants. Why do you think we need ethics in social research? Part of the reason is we want to make sure that we're keeping our participants, we want to keep them safe. We want to make sure that there's not going to be any harm done to them, that when they leave the research process, we're not affecting them in any negative way. Well, how do we get here to saying that we need ethics in social research when we're dealing with human subjects? The reason we got here was because we had a bunch of different ethical controversies, and these are a few of those. We had controversies surrounding anonymity and confidentiality with the tea room trade and Laud Humphreys. We had studies that made it so that participants incurred psychological harm, Stanley Milgram's study of obedience, and we also had participants incur other kinds of psychological harm, even physical harm, at the Stanford prison experiment. So we'll talk about what we learned from them and why we have ethical rules or guidelines nowadays. So the tea room trade is a study done by Laud Humphreys. Laud Humphreys was a sociologist, and he was interested in studying the sexual activities of men who have sex with men, those who may or may not be leading discreet lifestyles. He wanted to study gay sexual activities in public restrooms and parks, so he would go to various parks, and he volunteered at these parks in the restrooms to become the watch queen or the police lookout. So he would stand there, watch the door to make sure that police weren't coming in and catching the people engaging in sexual activities. And this is because the sexual activities were while people were in public restrooms. So police were concerned about this, and a lot of researchers knew about this, but Laud Humphreys took it to the next level and said, we're going to go out and study who these people are, what's going on in the context of these restrooms. So he volunteered to become the watch queen to watch out for police invading, and he wanted to know who was engaging in these sexual activities. Not only is Laud Humphreys potentially putting himself in danger in certain situations, that wasn't the ethical controversy. The ethical problem for Laud Humphreys was that while he was volunteering as the watch queen, he actually collected the license plate numbers of those who were going to the public restroom to engage in sexual activity with other men. So he took down their license plates, and then he was able to get his hands on driving records and was able to link those recorded license plates to addresses for those men who were participating in these tea rooms, and then met with these men at their homes to interview or confront them. Now, this is unethical in the sense that in social scientific research, we want to ensure that participants, the people who are studying, they're safe. We want to ensure that their responses are anonymous. They can't be tracked back to these individuals. A handful of these men had wives. They went home to their wives. Their wives knew nothing of it, but having a researcher come to your door may even had the effect of future participants not trusting researchers from then on out. Because if you're going to follow me, essentially, why should I trust a researcher? If the thing that I'm doing is anonymous, why are you following me? In many cases, some of these participants didn't even know they were being studied. So they were participating in something that they thought was a secret. The watch queen ended up not being an undercover police officer, but an undercover researcher who was tracking their moves, writing down their behaviors, writing down the information about the space. What we get from this is we're not ensuring anonymity and confidentiality for the participant. We're not even letting them know they're participants. So that's important for us to do when we're engaging in research, is let them know that their responses or their activities are going to be anonymous. Stanley Milgram study. This was a study into psychological harm. Stanley Milgram wanted to know about what was going on with obedience in World War II. A lot of people who were on trial at the Nuremberg trials as a part of the SS or Nazis, much of their defense centered on, well, I was just obeying orders. I was just being obedient to my commanding officer. So what Stanley Milgram wanted to find out was, are people under pressure just going to obey what somebody else or a superior says? He was able to bring in 2 individuals at a time into an experiment, and he would randomly assign one person the role of a quote unquote teacher, and then another person would be the student. And the teacher was actually the only participant in the study. So while he's bringing in 2 people, the only person actually being studied is the person who's given the role of teacher. The person who's given the role of a student was actually working with Stanley Milgram, what we call a confederate, somebody who works with the researcher to help them gather information. So the student who's working with Stanley Milgram goes into another room, with the doors closed and everything, and the teacher is told that they're going to engage in a test. What the teacher is supposed to do is say, hey, here's a list of words. I want you to recite them back to me. When the teacher starts reading the list of words, then the student has to repeat them back. The student is the person working with Stanley Milgram. The student repeats them back, and if they get a word wrong or miss a word, the teacher has to administer a level of shock to the student. Now, importantly, the teachers did not actually administer shocks to the student, but the student, because he was working with Stanley Milgram, would say, ah, that hurt, ah, that hurt. And in the context of this situation, a researcher standing there with the teacher and saying, no, increase the level of shock, harder, 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 more, 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 until the teacher is giving the student fatal levels of shock. Unbeknownst to the teacher, no one's being shocked, but the student is sitting there yelling and screaming, and then all of a sudden there's no more sound, basically making the teacher believe that he killed the participant on the other side, the student on the other side. The problem with this study is, while it is a study into obedience, right? The teacher's listening to what the researcher is saying, increasing shock, increasing shock, increasing shock. The ethical problem is that it deceived these people, these teachers. It deceived the participant who was the teacher into believing that they killed someone. Many times these people were sitting there crying in fear, shaking. They were yelling. They were stressed. Many of them felt like they were shocking this person to death against their will. And they were left with extreme psychological scars, in the sense that they didn't feel the same. They felt like, in the context of research, they had to kill somebody. Isn't something that should be taking place. There are actually interviews with prior participants, the teachers, asking them how it still affects their lives to this day. Ultimately, we don't want to leave people with psychological scars. We don't want to put them in a situation where they believe they killed somebody. Now, we got to have guidelines for how we attempt to deceive people, and if we do that, what the benefit of that deception is. Next, many of you have heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment by Philip Zimbardo. So Philip Zimbardo wanted to understand if authoritarian sorts of behaviors were dispositional, or what we call personal characteristics, or situational, contextual, environmental, right? So do people become authoritarian, brutal, sadistic people because that's just who they are? Or is that who they are because of their context, their environment? Sort of a nature versus nurture kind of thing. So what Philip Zimbardo did was he got some Stanford students, because this is where he was working at the time, gathered some participants for his study, and randomly assigned those Stanford students to either the role of a guard or a prisoner. This was supposed to be a 2-week experiment or a month-long experiment in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford. And I think it was after 6 days, they had to shut it down because the guards immediately, within hours, some of them began to immediately accept their authoritarian role, and they treated prisoners sort of like garbage just because they were given this role title, and that made them buy into what that role constituted. So after 6 days, the experiment was abandoned because guards began to physically and psychologically torture the prisoners. What's unfortunate about this is these people are incurring physical and psychological harm. We don't want anybody we're studying, or the stuff we're studying about them, we don't want it to negatively affect them. But these participants, they're participating not knowing they're going in to be physically and psychologically tortured. Importantly, investigators found out that Zimbardo didn't allow people to leave early. So once the physical and psychological torturing started happening, participants weren't allowed to leave. These participants weren't debriefed, right? They weren't given information about what happened, why were they participating in this project, what were the researchers trying to gather from this experiment. They didn't get any of that. And students weren't given a consent form to say, hey, I consent to these possible negative outcomes. And many of these people who participated still have lasting psychological trauma to this day. Ethical standards in research. Because of these 3 studies, as well as many others, organizations have developed a set of rules that are designed to help human research participants from harm and risk. So we need a set of rules to follow and to ensure that they're safe. But who sets them? 2 main groups set the rules. The main group, professional organizations, right? So professional organizations are like discipline-specific organizations, and they set the standards for what human subjects research looks like in that discipline. Many of you are members of the American Planning Association, right? American Psychological Association, ASPA, maybe American Sociological Association, maybe American Society of Criminology, right? ASC. These are the professional organizations for our disciplines, and each of these organizations sets up a bunch of rules, a set of rules for conducting research. If you're going to interact with humans in your research, this is what you need to do. So these professional organizations set these standards. In addition to that, each university that conducts research on humans needs to have what we call an institutional review board, or an IRB. And the IRB is a panel of experts at each university or institution, and these experts essentially enforce the rules that are given by organizations. So it's a panel of experts across various disciplines. They sit there, maybe they meet once a month. They review all of the proposals for conducting research before that research is conducted and say, well, they're abiding by this standard in this discipline, this standard, and this standard, but they haven't reached this one. So they may send it back and say, hey, you haven't shown us how, based on your discipline, you've met this standard of ethical conduct. So organizations are important, but also institutional review boards are sort of the enforcer. IRBs ensure that these researchers, before they start doing their research, are actually following these ethical guidelines. So who or what? IRBs are a panel of faculty at these universities or experts at these universities who review all research proposals involving human participants. You want to collect data on humans, you want to interact using direct observations with humans, you have to fill out an IRB application. And that IRB application goes directly to this panel of experts, and they'll review your work to see, is it really ethical? Is it minimizing risk and harm to these individuals? Where? Where do they exist? Well, IRBs exist at every institution that is federally funded or conducts research. So if you're getting federal money for research or you're conducting research with humans at all, you need to have an IRB. Why? Why do we have an IRB? Well, it's because we want to guarantee that our participants' rights and their psychological well-being will be protected. This is also to ensure that the risks faced by our human participants will be minimal. IRB is looking to see, are you minimizing risk for everybody who could potentially be a participant in your study? When do they meet? Usually they meet once per month at every institution. You can actually go to SDSU's IRB and get the application form for if you're actually doing human subjects research. You can fill it out and you can actually see the schedule for when they meet every month. So what are those ethical assurances that they're looking for that they want you to provide? One of the main ones is voluntary participation. This means that if you are collecting data from people, you can't force them to participate in your research. They are voluntarily participating in your research because they have the time or they're interested in the topic, unlike the Tuskegee study where Black men were essentially injected with syphilis and then denied treatment. These people were forced to participate in a study without consent that they were actually participating in a study. These researchers just wanted to figure out how long people could survive with a disease in their system, right? So this is another example of ethical controversies, and what we learn from this is that people have to be willing to participate. Two, that there's no harm being done to these participants. The IRB will look for, okay, are you injuring these people at all, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, or psychologically? Are you breaking off relationships? Are they incurring emotional harm? What about physical harm? They're trying to ensure that your proposal does not harm the subjects. Anonymity. Anonymity is this guarantee that neither the researchers nor the readers of the findings can identify a given response with a given respondent or participant. So basically, if I write a research article on interviews with 20 people, I need to ensure that if somebody's reading my article about these 20 people, they can't say, oh, yeah, that's Billy from down the road. We want to ensure that you can't identify those people. This is part of the controversy around Alice Goffman's work, in that some of the people she identified weren't given the anonymity that is required of high quality research. Many scholars have looked at her work and say, well, based on these characteristics that you've listed, we can easily identify this person, or we can boil it down to these three people who. So you want to ensure that these people remain anonymous. A way of doing that is giving people pseudonyms, fake names. So if it's really Billy, you call him Juan or something like that. Confidentiality. Confidentiality is a guarantee that if the researcher can identify a given response, they promise not to do so publicly. So what you're saying is all of their responses will remain confidential. If you find something that they say they've done and it might be damaging to their career or damaging to some relationships, it's got to stay between you and that participant. Sort of like doctor-patient confidentiality. The only way that you can give up sensitive information is if you're subpoenaed or under oath. And then finally, the use of deception. So if you're going to deceive participants, much like the Milgram study, much like the Stanford prison experiment, if you're going to mislead them for the purpose of getting information that would otherwise be hard to get, then these participants need to be informed of what's going on. You tell them after the study, after you've collected their data, you say, now we're going to debrief you about this is how you were deceived. This is how we lied to you in order to get this information. This is how we misdirected you or redirected you in order to get information. But IRB, what they're trying to look for is there a strong scientific justification for deceiving people? If not, then the use of deception is just nonsensical. IRB has methods of ensuring that your participants will know that you're abiding by these ethical guidelines. The way you do this is through informed consent. Informed consent is a legal form that your participants have to sign in order to participate. You can't just go in and say, hey, do you want to participate and start collecting data? They have to sign an informed consent form, like they are consenting to be a participant in your study. And IRB looks for this informed consent form. So if you don't have it, they're going to reject your application. Informed consent acknowledges that a person is, one, voluntarily participating, and that their voluntary participation in your research project is based on their full understanding of the total possible risks and harms that may come with participation. If there's a potential for information getting out, although you've ensured that it's not, they know that that could be a potential risk. If they're going to feel psychologically deterred in any way, they need to know about that. It also outlines the steps that the researchers are taking to ensure anonymity or confidentiality. Anonymity includes I'm giving these people pseudonyms, fake names, so they're going to remain anonymous, right? I won't know what your response is. I just know that this is anonymous. And confidentiality. Anything sensitive is not going to be given up. When you're going out on interviews, you're interviewing a bunch of people, you create a list with all their names and give those names pseudonyms, put that list away. Now you're only calling them by their pseudonym in your notes. Confidentiality really refers to once you start collecting those data, you're not going to let all of the information out. Only the patterns that you find. You're only letting out enough information about the patterns that you find. You're not taking your notebook with all your notes and all your recordings and handing them over to anybody. Keeping those locked up in a sealed container or a lockbox or something like that, you're ensuring that all of that information is confidential. It's not going to get out publicly. Informed consent also describes how long the study will take, meaning, this interview will last an hour and a half, or the survey will last you 30 minutes, so it'll take 30 minutes to complete. And then it finally also lists contact information for the research. So if the participant wants to follow up, they can. Which projects require IRB? So all projects that use direct observations of human subjects need to go through IRB. This includes those research projects that include primary data collection, like you're working directly with people. So interviews, surveys, ethnographies, experiments, participant observation, right? All of these things require that you get IRB approval, meaning you have to apply, send in the application, send in the informed consent form, describe all the methods that you're using to collect and analyze the data, all of that stuff. Projects that don't require IRB approval, anything that is not using direct observations or anything using indirect human observations, right? So content analysis, text analysis, looking at data from previously administered surveys, census data, crime data, all of those publicly available data. This means that these are data that have already been collected from humans, but you're not directly interacting with the humans from whom these responses are recorded. What that also means is that the person who actually collected those data, they had to go through IRB approval. So if you're analyzing previously administered surveys, that means the person or the researchers who had to administer those surveys, they had to get IRB approval to get those surveys. And finally, steps to jumpstart your ethical research. I've broken this down by secondary data analysis or primary observations. When you want to be ethical in your research, if you're using primary sources, right, you're working directly or direct observations with people, you develop research questions about the relationships You identify your materials and procedures for answering that research question. So you can use a questionnaire, interviews, what are your manipulation conditions, things like that. And you have an informed consent document. Then you submit an application to the IRB at your institution. You outline the procedures that you're going to engage in to answer that research question while working with human subjects. You include those materials as well as the consent form, and then you wait for approval. And that's the most important part. Timing your IRB application is important because you're going to have to, if you're working directly with human subjects, you have to get it approved before you can actually do the research. So you can't just submit it and say, well, I know it's going to be approved, so you start collecting data. Those data will not count, right? Those data will not count for your study because you haven't been approved by IRB to start collecting those data. So you can go ahead and start collecting those data, but they don't count in terms of the overall findings for your study. You have to wait for approval. And sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's several months before they get to your application. So you wait for approval. Now you can begin data collection only after your IRB application has been approved, and you can move on. With secondary data analysis, develop your research questions about the relationship between your variables. Materials and your procedures really are identifying data sets that already exist that include those variables. That'll help you answer your research question. No need to deal with IRB with a secondary data analysis. Although some have, there are unique cases where you might need to if there's sensitive information that requires special access. And then after that, you gather and you can merge various data sets. So I said this already. Proceed with caution because some data sets may require that researchers request special access, which may also require an IRB application saying, here's the sensitive information that exists in this already existing data set, and I need special access for it. I'm going to keep it confidential. People will remain anonymous, but I need these data to answer this specific question. In that sense, you're not dealing with direct observations, you're dealing with indirect observations, but there's such sensitive information in those secondary data that somebody could potentially identify those participants. So these are some things to keep in mind as you proceed with your research projects, and that is it.